Oh, Chasing Clarity, Health and Fitness Podcast. Ooh, that sounded really intense. Myself, Jeff Black, Brandon DeCruz, episode 43. Our badass guest, once again, Eric Helms, joining us. We're going to go on over all things hypertrophy training, frequency, advanced training techniques, stretch mediated hypertrophy, new adaptive thermogenesis research, to name a few things, because I'm sure it'll spiral out of control knowing how we talk. But nonetheless, Eric, thanks again for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. Always a pleasure and a privilege to be on. So thanks for having me back.
Sweet,
Absolutely.
man. So let's see, my last week has been good. I saw Brandon. I was in Tampa. We did the PEC7 down there. The Physique Education Collective is something that we started over at the Excellence Cartel, because we had, kind of got where there were seminars going on, but they weren't ever bringing on new coaches. And we wanted to be able to bring on and feature new coaches. Hell, that's how Brandon got to be able to get up there and present and make a check at it and so forth. So it's cool to do that and see it grow. We got some of our best feedback. Alan Aragon, it was nice to finally meet him, see Dr. Scott Stevenson, Laura Conlon. Her presentation on Turning Pro was great. And of course, Vince, Austin, the usual crew that we run with. But it was really cool to see like some new faces there and catch up with some new people and be in a room with people. I don't know, whenever I go to those seminars or host them, I always leave inspired. Just kind of like, oh shit, I really actually am in a cool industry with a bunch of people who do give a shit. And it's not the negativity swamp that I'm normally surrounded by on social media when I look at it. So it was really good. I enjoyed my time away. I found out before I left, I've got issue with my back. I got spondylolisthesis. So basically my spine is slipped forward. If I had, like I was telling Brandon, if I had offered to throw up my meal, that surgeon probably would have operated on me in 4 hours, and he was ready to go. And I was like, I don't know, like, because like I was, you don't know, Eric, but I've been battling this hip thing for 4.5 years. I had injured my hip vertical leg pressing. I have a brittle bone disease. I'm an idiot anyway, but I couldn't figure it out. And turns out if I had listened to 3 other doctors, I would have gotten a hip replacement I never needed. So now the spine surgeon, because the MRI uncovered this grade 1 endospondylothosis, and they're like, this guy's like, oh my God, you need to get operated. I'm like, whoa, 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 Tiger. Like, like I can still walk, I can still pee, I can still defecate, I can still do all the things, but I absolutely have like no space for my nerve root. So I'm just kind of waiting to see. I'm going to do physical therapy. I'm lightening my load. So Brandon, I've even lost 4 pounds since I saw you in Tampa.
Good.
So I've been coming down. So that way I'm not as much load on my spine. I'm only 5'2", and I was weighing 190 pounds at the start of my prep. I had pushed it pretty good.
Yeah, every pound counts.
Yeah, no, it does, especially when you're a midget.
Running, all these things.
Yeah, especially when you're a midget, it really matters. Like,
are you, Jeff? Let me ask you: are you officially 5'2"? Because I had someone comment on my photo today.
I commented back. I'm officially 5'2".
Because she wanted to know your exact height, and I said, "Listen, I'm 6'2.5". Like I have no idea, like in spatial, ability to grasp how tall or how short he is. Everyone is short.
Yes, I lost an inch probably from this back. Is probably what it is. Okay. So I was probably like a hearty 5'3" before this injury. But it was funny because he was like, "Oh, your back got worse from the thing and from April to now." And I'm like, dude, when you look at the X-rays, the April X-ray, they didn't even have me do a back bend. And in his X-ray, he had me do a back bend. I'm like, well, no shit, it's going to look completely different. And then secondly speaking, he's like, well, why aren't you concerned? I'm like, dude, I was hack squatting like 400 pounds just last week, and I've been doing dumbbell shrugs. It's not like I've been treating my back really well because you guys told me the injury was a hip. So now I have to completely redo everything. But nonetheless, it's just a challenge, and it's something new I have to learn to work around. And it isn't the end of the world. It affects millions of people. It's just a matter of challenging my mind to understand that I have to change some things that I might not like to change. But I've been bodybuilding for 27 years, and I love the shit so much that I'm willing to change how I have to change to still play the game. And that just lets you know, even at 42, I'm willing to be uncomfortable to continue doing things I love. And that's what I would like to impart to everybody is you might have to change things along the way, but it doesn't mean you have to stop doing what you love. And that could be in any pursuit of what you're doing. Like Eric with his research, Brandon, as he gets ready to go into the research field, doesn't matter. You just sometimes have to think around problems that you're presented with. So overall, it was good stuff. And I really enjoyed my week and seeing everybody, especially you, B. It was nice to get a good juicy hug on a chair from you.
Absolutely, my man. Actually, I'm really excited to give this recap because Jeff ended up leaving a little bit early, had to get back to his son. So he hasn't even heard my full recap as to the PEC and how
Oh man,
my
I gotta
nights
pee
ended up
too.
going.
I'm gonna have to wait. So
Yeah,
now
you
I
got
have
to
to
wait, and then I'll take over the show, and we'll go into the
Okay, now I
intro
can
with
take
Eric,
hold. All
and
right.
then you can go to the bathroom, take your bathroom break. But yeah, so I actually just got back last night. So Jeff has been back home for a few days now, and I just got back last night from this weekend's Physique Education Collective. And I have to say, I'm going to be honest. Obviously, I've been a part of this for a few years now. I've presented twice, so far, but I've also been to about 5 out of the 7. And I got to say, this was my favorite one. This year's event was my favorite to date. And I've actually gotten a lot of feedback from others who have attended multiple PECs who have said the same. So I think we're in alignment in terms of our overall experience as to how this weekend went. And so, just to give a little bit of recap of this weekend, on Friday, I had the honor of kicking off the seminar weekend by giving the first presentation, which I did. My topic was on optimizing insulin sensitivity and blood glucose management for improving body composition and health outcomes. And this was a topic that a lot of people know me for, metabolic health and things of that sort, in addition to body composition improvement. But really, I opened up to the audience, and this is something that Jeff has always imparted me with, to be really brutally honest and really give, an internal reason as to why, intrinsic driver as to why I pick the topics that I pick. And this is stuff that I generally wouldn't cover on a podcast, or I wouldn't, say unless I really not put under the gun, but essentially in a room of people that I really respect and that I feel comfortable alongside. But really, when it comes down to it, this was a topic I wanted to take a deep dive into and compile like a fully comprehensive masterclass on. Because I lost my father actually to diabetes related complications, and I saw him suffer from many of these complications, including heart disease, kidney disease, kidney failure, and dementia. So after years of not managing his blood sugar correctly, he started getting progressively worse. And unfortunately, much of like the decline in his health happened prior to me being, me even entering high school. And so by the time I started getting into the nutrition space and into my career, and I started learning about a lot of these things, about nutrition, about, movement, about all the, supplementation and things that could be utilized to improve upon these things from a lifestyle intervention standpoint. He had already had open heart surgery. He was already being put on dialysis. He was already suffering from the cognitive decline of dementia. And so I always think about the fact that, if I knew then what I know now, especially when it comes to insulin resistance, I might have been able to change the trajectory of his life or his latter stages of his life. But nonetheless, it led me to being extremely interested in this topic and passionate about making sure that, those that I do work with, they're not only able to, as a coach, a lot of times we only think about the external, or we only think about, improving someone's body composition. And really, when it comes down to it, I do want to do that, but I also want to help people improve their lives. And especially when it comes down to it, like I work with high level competitors, but I work with a lot of Gen Pop clients that are, pre-diabetic, or they're suffering from some metabolic issues that we can improve upon. I'm not trying to take the role of a medical practitioner, but at the same time, there's so many nutritional, lifestyle, stress management, sleep, quality interventions that we can pull, so many levers that we can pull to improve upon this. So this was really a great topic that I was very fortunate to be able to talk on, and I was happy to be able to relay my passion out to the audience. And then other than that, I know that we're probably going to have to do a full episode, Jeff, on like all our lessons from PEC, because, maybe bring the guys on from the Excellence Cartel and do a full episode on this. Because I don't want to run up our whole time clock with Eric. We have him here and we're super happy to do so, but I do want to hit on like 2 of my highlights of the week so that Jeff hears this, because he did leave a little bit early. So, when it comes to some of my highlights from this, the first one has to be, Jeff, you were there and gave me the honor of doing this, but it was being able to meet and introduce one of my original mentors, Alan Aragon, who I originally had asked, listen, do you want to be a part of the Physique Education Collective? And he came out, he met with us. And prior to his presentation, I was able to introduce him to the audience in public, thank him for the impact he's had on my own career, the calls that we've had, the consultation, the Zooms, all that he's imparted on me throughout my career and has allowed me to impart on others. And then also we were able that Friday night, to host a Q&A together. So imagine someone that you've learned from 15 plus years, being able to be on the same panel with him and bouncing, ideas and question and answers off of each other. That was a highlight to say the least. But then the second is actually Jeff was unable to
Can I inject something real quick?
Yes.
That was a highlight that was big for me. I told Keegan about was being able to have a seminar that I had a hand in creating and watch a coach like you claw and dig your way to get up on that panel to be able to present and then be able to introduce and do a Q&A with someone that you have over 15 years of respect and idolization for everything they've done with your career. That was a true highlight for me. So thank you for taking that on, because I knew you had no clue that I was going to throw that your way to introduce Alan.
I was up for the challenge, man.
But I was standing up there. I was like, nah, Brandon's the one to introduce this guy. So thanks, man. Thanks for letting me interrupt you on that. But it was a good
Absolutely,
moment, man.
Thank
you.
Well, then the second highlight, just to go over briefly, and this is something Jeff's not aware of, but after the PSC wrapped up on day 2, I ended up getting invited out to dinner with Alan and with Dr. Scott. So we ended up going for all you can eat sushi, and what I assumed was going to be a short dinner turned into a 4-hour dinner where we closed out the restaurant.
Oh yeah, so, yeah.
We ended up staying at the restaurant until closing time, and it was just a full night, a long night, and a long conversation of exchanging stories, diving into different topics related to nutrition, training, coaching, and then also our own lives. And a big thing that I got to take away from it was we had like an hour where we just talked about like research designs and interpretations, and just went back and forth on like the latest research within the last year. And it was really, good to hear people, other individuals or other professionals' point of views. And I'm always trying to take on other people's interpretations of things to open up my own ability to critically think better. And so, anyone who knows me also knows that I've been consulting with both Scott and Alan for over a decade. So I've taken a ton from them. I've learned a ton from them. So to be able to spend the entire evening with them, sharing our stories and experiences, was an incredibly enjoyable experience for me, and definitely the highlight of my weekend. So overall, an incredible week, very productive. I want to thank everyone that came out to the PEC, everyone that has emailed me, DM me, given, all of us in totality as a group, as a panel, positive feedback about it, because this is how we continue to improve and how we continue to evolve in terms of our own personal development in being able to bring you better information, but as well as a full panel, and we work together cohesively to make these events happen. So, really proud of this event. I cannot wait to the next one. And other than that, my week's been good. But Eric, catch us up on your last week.
Last week, yeah. So I don't know if anyone's been paying attention to the international news, but there's been a lot of flooding in the Auckland area in New Zealand where I live. So yeah, heart goes out to all of the families and organizations that have had to deal with that. We've been very fortunate where we live. It's not an area that's prone to flooding in Auckland, so we've been all right. But yeah, so I haven't gone into AUT. That's been closed a little bit, and it's just been kind of crazy. More rainfall in any single day than there has ever been on record, just a few days back. But yeah, so not exactly. It's summer here because we're in the southern hemisphere. Doesn't feel like it though. So it's been a little wild. But besides that, no, things have been good. Kind of getting back into the swing of things, with the way kind of university schedules go. Stuff's pretty closed down over like the December, January period, but no, things are good. I'm actually starting my diet contest prep for the 2023 season in like 3 days. So
ooh, very interesting. Yeah, February.
Yeah.
So do you have, obviously you are someone that I'm assuming kind of, if you're anything like myself, you kind of work yourself backwards. So you have an end date and then you work your contest prep from, going the trajectory backwards. So any potential shows that you'll be entering into, or even like a lineup of dates?
Yeah. So the goal was I wanted to compete at WMBF Worlds. So I knew that I had to kind of backshift things so that I would make it.
It's a long season.
Based upon my 2019 prep, I dieted from mid-December until mid-August, and that was right around the time where I was like tapping out. So I just kind of shifted that back a bit so that I'm starting in early February to get to mid-November. So yeah, I've got WMBF Worlds, which is going to be mid-November. There's a new WMBF Australia affiliate, so that show I think will be end of October. And then there is the New Zealand WMBF show, which I'll be doing, which I judged at last year. So that is, I think, end of September on the books right now. And then there's potentially a show in Singapore that I might do. That's kind of, believe it or not, relatively closer to me than the States. But I'm also planning on potentially doing a show with Jeff Alberts in October in Seattle. There's a pro-am that we might be looking at. So I've got a real packed schedule from September to November.
No, but that's honestly, that's ideal because you want to get in shape and just kind of hang on or be able to eat up into shows. I really like doing that with a lot of my competitors where I'll get them ready early and I essentially just walk up their calories back. I'm getting them in a better state of energy availability. You're still shredded. You know what I mean? Like I've been
Yep.
4.5% body fat on the DEXA. You can eat as many carbohydrates or as much food as possible. You'll feel a little bit better, like especially session to session, but you feel like death. I mean, being at those low percentage of body fat, but I do know with especially the natural bodybuilding, your schedule, it is so elongated. So I've had people compete at different areas, or there's so many organizations, especially within the natural organizations, and so they're able a lot of times to bounce from federation to federation. But sometimes I've had certain pros that they're doing shows in July up until November, and it's just a really it's really difficult, especially from like if we look at natural physiology, we're not meant to be that lean for a couple weeks, let alone for months on end. So generally, you'll start seeing more loss of lean body mass, more loss of performance within the gym, and then also the signs of relative energy deficiency. So it's good that you obviously a very intelligent individual. To make your mark and really kind of schedule things in a way that's going to best suit not only your ability to be your best, but also feel your best. You know what I mean? Because bodybuilding is none of our careers. So it's like you got to manage students. You have to fulfill your responsibilities with mass and 3DMJ and your podcast. And I believe you're going on like a world tour or something with Omar. Is that correct?
Yeah, Omar and I are. Well, let me just say, if I was actually intelligent, I would just not compete in bodybuilding. But yeah, no. So Omar and I are trying to do some filming, so some more kind of documentary style work for Iron Culture. So between me competing at Worlds, you know, Jess competing at the Sheffield and me coaching there. And then also me coaching at IPF Worlds, which will be in June in Malta, and a trip out to the University of Texas at Austin, where they have the Stark Center, which is where the biggest repository of physical culture history in the world is. The filming in all those locations and interviews with some people at certain labs that I have connections with, it should be a really, really cool thing. So basically, I'm traveling
much of the year.
So,
Are you excited? Because this is, I know that you were very prominent in the seminar speaking scene, especially pre-COVID, and you still do a lot of it, but it has shifted. Like even myself, I used to go to a seminar every single month. And the least that I ever did throughout the last 10 years prior to COVID was I would go once every quarter. And that was just due to the fact that I was just so busy with my my profession, and I couldn't leave the Northeast. However, since then, we've seen that so many things have went to an online format or to a webinar and things of that sort. But are you excited to get back on the road and, really be able to engage with more people? Like I could tell, with at least within our interactions, you seem very extroverted. So I feel like you would love to be like traveling and doing those things, but I could be wrong.
I have elements of extroversion, but I don't know if I am as extroverted as I can come across, because I'm an external processor. Like I figure things out and as I talk sometimes, which I think it lends me to being a good speaker, which is I'm fortunate to have that conversation, a skill set. Yeah, exactly. But I did notice in 2018 and 2019 that I was starting to get burned out from traveling and speaking. I think for context, even the shortest flight, if I'm going to go to a place where there is a conference that's going on from Auckland, we're talking 4 hours if I want to get to the east coast of Australia, and that's the shortest flight. But when I get asked to speak in Hong Kong or Singapore, now we're 9 hours. If I get asked to speak in the States, now we're 12 to 13 hours, depending on where that is. If I get asked to speak in Europe, it's a day of travel. And kind of the way things have gone for me is that most of the time I'm getting asked to speak in the UK, Australia, or the States, Southeast Asia. So it's a lot of travel, and I think there's a difference between being asked to go speak at places and then kind of having your own plan to go do things. Like I know I'll be burned out by the end of this year, but I won't be at all like, I don't ever want to speak at a conference again. Like I do get towards the end of the year, and I just found that there is a threshold where if I reach it, then it starts to become something that I don't enjoy as much.
Absolutely.
And because my initial perspective, kind of like you were sharing with PEC, was when I first got invited to go speak at some of these seminars with the same people you were talking about who I had looked up to and who had been a mentor to me. I think the first time I spoke somewhere was like 2013. It was a crazy experience. Someone's offering to fly me out, put me up, and talk about bodybuilding to a bunch of other people who are like-minded.
Exactly.
How could I say no? So I didn't say no, and I never said no for 6 years. And it got to the point where I think in 2018 and 2019 there were fewer months out of the year that I was actually staying in Auckland than I was out, and that actually started to become too much. So
Absolutely.
COVID gave me a reset, and we had some pretty serious lockdowns here in Auckland, which I obviously I don't want to make light of a pretty serious thing and that affected a lot of people, but I felt I benefited from that because it forced me to have to say no to a lot of things. And then I was able to reflect on what is the amount that I want to do. And now I'm very selective. So when people ask me to go speak, it is something that I'm much more comfortable saying no to. So I have like a couple of key ones I do. Like I speak at the UEBC, the Ultimate Evidence-Based Conference in Melbourne, which is typically in the last quarter of the year, and that's one kind of like locked in. And then there is typically one or two others that I'll do in a year. So besides that, though, I don't do a ton of the speaking engagements just because I got so much going on.
Absolutely.
So
and you can make your impact
yeah,
in other aspects in other places. And that was actually a
absolutely.
conversation I had at dinner with Dr. Scott and with Alan, because obviously as I get deeper into my career, I have been getting invited to more places. But however, just to give you some context, I was in the sports nutrition field, or I was a sales director, and I did product formulation for many brands for 14 years. So there was years that just in a car I put 75,000 miles on the road, and then there was also time periods in time where I went to every single expo. So LA Fit Expo, Arizona Expo, all the Arnolds, your Olympia, all small and big expos. And so I was on the road up to some years 38 to 40 weeks a year. And so I feel that same burnout. Just I wasn't presenting on just nutrition stuff, but there was even occasions where like my biggest account in the country that I personally worked with all the executives there was bodybuilding.com. And I had, an obligation to them to go out at least 1 week every single month. So I loved Boise. Don't get me wrong. I was able to train in their facility and get footage there. But you know what? After a while, it burns you out. So I can completely relate to where you're going. And sometimes it's better to pick a few spots. Like just like you would the bodybuilding show. You might be in shape, but it doesn't mean you have to do every single show. You pick your spots, you really lay down quality information, and you focus on that quality of impact over the quantity of impact. And then you could fill it in the back if you're someone that just gets that intrinsic motivation and drive to really give back. And I could tell that is who you are. You know what I mean? Altruistic in nature. And so you could do that through podcasts. I don't know anyone really that does more podcasts than you, which is a blessing to us. I'm taking full advantage of it, guys. I'll admit to it. But we're still able to get back to this industry in a different fashion than in person, which is a blessing of the modern, social media age.
100% agree. And this might sound elitist or shitty, but I really hate most of the bodybuilding industry, not any individual person. But
I understand where you're coming from.
I would have burned out within 3 weeks of doing what you were doing. Like expos, just to show you how much of an extrovert I'm not, expos I hate. Absolutely hate. Like, don't get me wrong.
You're speaking
I love
to the choir, my man. I love certain individuals there, but the entire aura of it's just not me. And that's why I exited that industry, or one of many reasons.
You lasted a lot longer than I would have, brother. But let's just say, if anyone's heard me on podcast, they know how I see things in the fitness industry. And I focus on the positives, and I do try to give back through that, because there's plenty of negative. And I have to be very selective with how I participate, or I get burned out quickly. So yeah,
I can completely relate to that. All right, so before we go into the ebbs and flows of the fitness industry, we're going to turn it back to our topic. And so we wanted to have you back on, Eric, this week to follow up on our last episode, which we recorded together, which was, I believe, episode 36. And essentially throughout that episode, we covered the relationship between training volume and training intensity. So this episode, we wanted to round out that discussion by covering training topics and other aspects of training, such as training frequency, and then going into some of the other hypertrophy programming considerations like rest intervals, advanced training techniques, and then diving into something that's a hobby horse of mine. I really would love to get your opinion and your insight into it, which is a more nuanced topic of stretch mediated hypertrophy. And that's had a ton of evidence come out for it, or out on it recently. So first, to kick off the conversation, let's discuss training frequency. If you can you give us some general recommendations on training frequency? And then I know personally, because I've heard you speak on the topic of training frequency, what are some of the potential benefits to training with a higher frequency, in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, training frequency is something that I've kind of come full circle on as the research has evolved. I would say in the 2011 to 2013 era, we had these disparate hints that perhaps the what was truly, I would say, dogma at that time of the way you train for both bodybuilding and powerlifting maybe weren't necessarily, you know, the bee's knees. And to give context to anyone who's newer in the industry or newer to the sport, you know, squatting and deadlifting more than once a week, no, you don't do that. And if you do, one's got to be a DE day. The other one can be an ME day, but that DE day has got to be light, you know. And you're like, well, some people are going, what's a DE day? Like, you don't know. You weren't there when Westside was in control of the whole industry. But yeah, so basically you can only have one hard squatter deadlift session a week. Bench, maybe you can throw in some additional work there. So the highest frequency you'd see in powerlifting, which I think was heavily influenced by the leadership being all super heavies and the style, you know, I mean, it's very, very aggressive training, was a frequency of, you know, once per week squat, deadlift, twice per week bench. And that's pretty much it. You can maybe do some accessories. But I remember experimenting with 3 times a week bench and looking at some of the Shiko stuff and felt like I was breaking some kind of rule. And in a similar time period, Lane Norton came out with FAT, if you will, PHAT, the Power Hypertrophy Adaptive Training Split. And at the time, and still to some degree, the dominant way of training is body part splits. And I remember I just liked training muscle groups more frequently just because I loved training early on in my career. So I would always gravitate towards body part splits that kind of broke the 1 time per week rule. I remember my favorite split back in the day was a chest and back, legs, shoulders, arms, repeat, take an off day. And then I could be a sneaky bad boy and train each muscle group twice per week. But you weren't supposed to do that. You know, each muscle group needed its own day. You break it down, build it up, rest and recover. And in this time period, there were also some studies coming out that indicated, hey, maybe this 1 time per week thing isn't too hot. There's the mythical, never published abstract of the Norwegian frequency study, which came out that found members of the IPF Norwegian powerlifting team got bigger and got stronger, taking the same volume and breaking it up into multiple days. And then Brad Schoenfeld and colleagues, they had a study where they compared 1 versus 3 times a week hypertrophy training. Now we're into like 2015. Oh, they got bigger. And then, oh shit, 2016, Schoenfeld and colleagues has a meta-analysis looking at frequency. And we see that although there's disparate data, the effect sizes and the significance is leaning in favor of higher frequency, even with equated volume. So circa 2016, I was kind of like, all right, so higher frequency independent of volume and load is better for both strength and hypertrophy. It wasn't a super strong conclusion, but I still held on to the key element that I would use to describe frequency of this is a method of organizing training stress. Absolutely. And I'm glad I did, rather than kind of leaning into my biases, because personally as an athlete, I have benefited from higher frequency training. It's been, and volumes, I will say.
But you didn't attribute the gains or the increases that you saw just to frequency on its own. It was more of the ability to allocate volume and frequency being a tool to do so. Am I correct?
I would say yes. I think I also thought there was something to more frequent practice for lifts.
Okay.
And I think I didn't go full Menno Henselmans, you know, and shout out to my boy, like respect. Like I'm not tossing shade his way, but if anyone remembers 6 years ago, he was like, listen, if you're an intermediate, you got to be training 3 times a week or you're missing out. Muscle protein synthesis shortens. You got to take advantage of that. Here's some mechanisms.
You're losing the time window. Yes.
Yeah.
I remember I was in favor of it at the time, be honest.
Yeah. And to be fair, you know, when you don't have the data, you connect dots that you have. And I don't think I remember Schoenfeld really disagreeing and Henselman's not. And I found myself somewhere in the middle, and probably just because I'm a little more conservative. But now we fast forward to 2022. There's been a ton of research in this area. And what it's really starting to shake out to, there's actually a handful of meta-analyses now. So Schoenfeld did an updated meta-analysis after the 2016 one, which basically found a similar effect only when not controlling for volume. So when not doing a sub-analysis looking at equated volume studies, did they find an independent effect of frequency. And on the strength side of it, we've got like 3 meta-analyses. There's Ralston 2018, weekly training effects on strength gain and meta-analysis. There is another one by Cuthbert and colleagues, which looks at trained athletes, which came out in 2021. And there is another one which is escaping me, which I'm sure will come back as we keep talking. But there's 3 meta-analyses now. And the most recent one by Schoenfeld, how many times per week should a muscle be trained to maximize hypertrophy, and they all found the same thing, essentially, is that when we don't equate volume, yes, higher frequencies seem to be associated with better rates of muscle growth or better rates of strength gain. And there are some differences there, maybe a little more potent when you're looking at like multi-joint lifts for strength or upper body, if I recall correctly. But ultimately, it seemed to be a side effect of the total training stress, which validates kind of the perspective that I've had from, hey, training frequency is a tool to organize training stress, whether the goal is strength, whether the goal is hypertrophy. And we have some non-published data that also kind of gives hints at this. So shout out to James Krieger. He's done some non-peer-reviewed meta-analyses looking at and I think we talked about this last time.
We did in terms of dose per session to maximize hypertrophy.
And that tells you something, right? So if we know that once you start doing more than, say, 8 to 10 sets for a given muscle group in a session, if you know that you also benefit from doing, say, 16 sets in a week, what do? Oh, you have another session or 3 sessions or what have you. So it starts to suggest that, hey, frequency can be like a valve for allowing the training stress as it needs to be higher, or you would benefit from it being higher, to be distributed in such a way that allows recovery. And I think we're still lacking, like even if you were to look at these 3 meta-analyses and you looked at all the individual studies, there's not a ton on trained athletes, and there's not a ton that are looking at really high volumes, and there's not a ton really looking at some of these higher frequencies. There's a few, don't get me wrong, like Calhoun had a 6-verse-3 frequency, which originally when this research started coming out, 3-verse-1 was the high versus low frequency group. Absolutely. And now the 3 is the low frequency comparison in that Calhoun study. So we don't have a lot of data looking at reasonably well-trained people doing high frequencies with high volumes to really tease out, is there ever an independent effective frequency? And I sort of think there has to be, if there is a per session volume relationship to where doing too much you don't get the benefit from. Because you have to think there are some people, or there are scenarios where you'd benefit from doing more volume than you can do in a single session per week. So therefore, you'd think there must be a benefit to higher frequencies than 1 or 2 times per week in some cases. I don't have a study I can trot out to, well, I do have studies I can trot out to prove that, but the data as a whole does not support that statement I just made. But I think as a coach, your goal is not to think about the average mean benefit for the largest bell curve of the population. It's to think about different scenarios and have all the tools you need on your bat belt, batterings, all the good stuff, get on top of the roof, embarrass the Joker again, all that good stuff. You got to do a lot as a coach, just like Batman. I don't know why I'm sticking with this Batman analogy.
Just roll with it.
I'm going to, yeah. But that means there are times when you may have an athlete who would benefit from higher frequencies to distribute that training stress. You may have an athlete who absolutely will not need to do that, or their training schedule is constrained, and you don't have to be afraid that pumping up the volume, to quote a fabulous song, is too much for any given day. So I think the data right now suggests that we probably need to think about individual differences more than anything else. And I would refer people back to our last podcast that we did together, where I talked about some data by DeMoss showing that people using different volumes, but also different frequencies, may benefit individually and differentially, depending upon just their individual characteristics.
No, absolutely. And I'm a advocate of higher frequency, and I think it's more so because what I've seen in the trenches, and the majority of people I work with are intermediate or advanced. And so, like you mentioned, we do not have a lot of research on advanced individuals. And even when we do have well-trained individuals, they're training 2 to 3 times per week. So there's a cap on, their per session volume, their weekly volume, and then also their frequency. So like you alluded to, we don't have these higher frequency training studies, or we're really able to piece things out. And that's where we really have to differentiate between what we see in mechanistic data, especially short-term mechanistic data, like you alluded to with Menno Henselmans, and then also what can we utilize in terms of translational research, which is really what your forte is, which is why we love having you on. And that's where we can combine what we see in the literature, some of the hints or some of the trends, because oftentimes there is something that isn't maybe statistically significant, but it may be significant in practice when applied to the right population. We just didn't have the greatest sample population to really tease that out where there was statistical or there was clinical significance within the findings. And so in my own, practice, I've found, as you have, that by utilizing a higher frequency, it allows us to spread out our weekly, our total weekly training volume over multiple sessions. So we're going to get better quality volume each session. We don't get into that area where we're going over that, say, 8 to 10 sets per muscle group, and we get into that realm of like junk volume, where you can keep doing work, but you're going to notice that set 11, 12, say you're doing 20 sets in a workout, like some people do once per week in the pro split type of, arrangement, you may be still able to survive in the gym, but the body, the entire, intention of hypertrophy training is not only to just be able to survive and get outside the gym, it's to recover and be able to adapt and to be able to get back to baseline before that next session. And also, I think about it from a fatigue standpoint. By dividing things up more, we're able to, when we say if we were to just look at like central fatigue or even peripheral fatigue, we see that higher volumes generally will increase, higher amounts of sets will increase peripheral fatigue, which can lead downstream to induce central fatigue. So if you're doing a ton of volume in a single day, you're going to accumulate more of that volume instead of getting a little bit of a dose. So how I like to, extrapolate it to or analogize it with is getting a suntan. You could go out in, right now you're in summer in New Zealand. So you can be in Auckland and you can go get yourself burnt for a couple of hours, or you could titrate that dose and go a few, 20 minutes every single day, really get nice and brown and adapt and actually get your body a sufficient stimulus to get a nice suntan instead of getting burned. We could do the same thing in context of the gym. We can either go there and smash ourselves. And the reason why we can only train once per week in terms of training frequency is because we just don't have the recovery capacity to get back in, whether it be physical or mental, to get ourselves to do another leg day within that week. Or we could titrate the dose, use more of a smart and intelligent programming perspective where we do it on multiple days throughout the week. And we kind of, divide that total weekly volume that we need for that threshold to meet to actually induce adaptations to actually grow muscle, and do it in a way that allows us to recover better, get better quality sets each and every time we walk in the gym, and hopefully over longer time periods see better gains as a result.
Well said. I don't have a ton more to add to that. I think you positioned that really well. I will only add 2 things. One, the meta-analysis. I couldn't remember the lead author on is Gurgic, which came out just a little bit before the Ralston one on that, which I just need to, because I'm OCD to remember the one I forgot. And the second thing, 2 hours in the sun in Auckland or New Zealand or Australia, you're going to be a lobster because we don't have much ozone down here. So absolutely, that's where you'd benefit from the environmental circumstances, quite literally, of needing a higher frequency, lower dose approach, which I think is a perfect analogy for this. Sometimes the environmental situations which an athlete or an individual would benefit from having such an approach. But like you said, you can certainly make it work with lower frequencies, higher volumes. And this, of course, interacts with proximity to failure and exercise selection to a pretty big degree. And I think a lot of the reason why the lower frequency approach was so strong for so long, and certainly is sufficient, because we've seen some people develop amazing physiques and get incredibly strong, is because of some of the other cultural traditions of, we're taking each one of these sets very close to failure. We're emphasizing a lot of very challenging exercises. So the fatigue per unit of volume is quite high. So how could we train again,
Absolutely.
In another session? And that doesn't necessarily always have to be that way.
No, I couldn't agree more. So got onto training frequency. Next topic, Eric, what would you suggest in terms of length of rest intervals between sets? Because we have, a lot of back and forth in this industry about this. And this is something I find very much utility speaking with my clients about this, especially when they come from some of the areas within this industry where they're always emphasizing different phases of training. So they have metabolite training and neural phase training, and they're always bouncing between different phases, and they'll utilize rest intervals as a way to progress the training stimulus, to induce more metabolite accumulation, things of that sort. So a lot of these times I get new clients and they're used to rushing in between sets, not realizing the potential detriments to that from a training performance perspective.
Yeah, I think we are really not at the point where, well, okay. So I'm going to take one step back and talk about our understood mechanisms of hypertrophy. There's like the big three, which are now kind of like the big one plus 0.5 and maybe not
with the
one
backdoors.
Yeah, exactly. Of the idea that it is, mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage, and that we actually need to design, and therefore training phases and periodization for hypertrophy should emphasize these three things. And then therefore it should be heavy training for tension. It should be low rest period, high rep supersets, pump work for the metabolic stress. And then it should be maybe heavy training, but long muscle lengths past failure, eccentrics. I'm not sure.
Maybe some downhill running.
Exactly. Right. So I don't think that makes sense. And some of those things don't do what you think they do. So just some interesting take homes. If you were to do a set of a 3RM on any exercise, the metabolites produced per rep are higher than if you were doing a 20RM. You're just getting more net metabolites being produced from doing more work. So they actually, don't follow the relationship you'd think. You have to think about this like, okay, so if I was to do like 10 sets of 3 versus 3 sets of 10, I might actually have more metabolite accumulation, even though one would fit that category. So how do you program this, right? Also, which metabolites matter? And is it area under the curve? Is it, and to what degree is this having an impact if I'm actually hurting myself in other ways to do this? So if I'm restricting my rest intervals, and if I'm actually creating this cardiovascular stress, is that acute fatigue impeding my ability to actually generate tension to the point where maybe that metabolite accumulation is not being, it's not facilitated, it's
debilitative,
right? Exactly. So, and instead of kind of hanging out here in mechanistic land where we don't really actually have a clear picture, and you could make arguments either way, we can just look at the translational research. And there is a very clear trend when you start restricting rest intervals under 2 minutes, and especially under 1 minute in any kind of traditional training setup, where you see dampened hypertrophy and dampened strength gains. And the only time this seems to be controverted is in studies where they progressively decline the rest period. So they come down from 2 minutes and then it's 15 seconds less the next week. So you're getting people in better shape.
Yeah, there's an acclimation period.
Exactly, where they purposely have an acclimation period. Or when you are looking at studies on quote unquote intensity techniques, so things like drop sets or supersets, which predominantly use single joint exercises. So that to me paints this overall picture. Earlier, you were talking about the interplay between peripheral and central fatigue, where the issue here is that when you're generating a ton of cardiometabolic stress, that can lead on to central stress, or central fatigue, which leads to actual central inhibition. So your inability to recruit motor units, and therefore the muscle fibers that they innervate, so that the stress you can apply is now just substantially dampened. And even though it feels very hard, a lot of that quote unquote hardness is not actually contributing to the goal you're trying to get. So yeah, what does that mean? Well, it means that it's okay to have shorter rest intervals and use some of these quote unquote intensity techniques, so long as it's not producing this large cardiometabolic burden. And there's ways around that. You can be in better shape. I guarantee you that a CrossFitter is going to get a lot more out of, some type of crazy supersetted workout than a powerlifter who's doing that as a new block, or a bodybuilder who just came off of a tension and a damage block, and now they're going into this quote unquote metabolic stress block that they're out of shape for, and it feels really, really hard, and they do a lot of work, and they're getting in much better cardiovascular shape, and they're getting much better at buffering. Their muscle physiology is changing, but they're probably not growing very much.
And that's really, when I hear these arguments to go into these other phases, we can give the example of a CrossFitter. Well, what got them to the point where they can handle that type of workload and those type of short intervals isn't conducive to hypertrophy. Yes, they're going to accumulate volume, so they may grow. And there's many within the CrossFit scene that, due to genetic, predispositions, great genetics, and overall total work volume, because they're in the gym 3 times per day, they are, a very muscular athlete. But when we look at them in comparison to a bodybuilder, there is no comparison in most times. So if we're really looking at hypertrophy, kind of my mindset on this is, let's do what has already been the principles. Doesn't mean you have to utilize one set programming. However, let's look at the principles that are aligned best with hypertrophy, maximizing mechanical tension and utilizing that as the key driver towards that. And so when I speak with clients about this, the one study I often go back to is Schoenfeld et al. 2016. And within that study, it's an 8-week intervention. And they took resistance trained males and split them up into 2 groups. And essentially, one group rested 1 minute, which is very common, especially 5 or 6 years ago, while the other group rested 3 minutes. And they saw that in all aspects of their training, they utilized the same training program. But at the end of the intervention, they found that the 3-minute rest interval group experienced greater muscle growth at all sites. So we saw it in the triceps, we saw it in the quadriceps. They also saw greater increases in bench press and squat 1 rep max. And there was equal increases in muscular endurance. So it wasn't like the short rest interval group got much better within session. However, they accumulated a lot more fatigue. And that's where I really come back to, let's keep the goal, just like Dan John would say. And so if the goal is hypertrophy, let's utilize the principles that we know that are going to maximize our ability to perform for hypertrophy. So if your limiting factor in a set is your cardiometabolic fatigue, that isn't your muscular induced fatigue. And so the reason why you're stopping or think you're at failure, and we see this in the data on high rep sets, low load, high repetitions versus high load, low repetitions, a lot of times they're not getting to failure, or their ability to gauge proximity to failure is much less accurate as a result of that metabolite accumulation, the lactate. The fact that they're really uncomfortable and it's hard to get to failure. And that's why we even see, I forget, I'm sure you're familiar with the repetitions and reserve research. It might've been Steele that saw that advanced individuals are more, inclined to be accurate with gauging proximity to failure, but also in lower repetition sets. So sets of, I believe it was 10 or maybe 8 reps and below, not in those higher repetition ranges.
Yeah, and that's been shown in multiple studies now, and actually been meta-analyzed. If you were to look at Halpern et al. 2021, it's the meta-analysis on RPE accuracy. One of the moderators is whether it's fewer than 12 reps per set, the accuracy improves, and it gets worse if you're doing over 12 reps per set. And there also, in that meta-analysis, there wasn't a significant effect of training age, but it couldn't actually include that study by Steele because they used a different design. They were prospectively saying, what do you think you could do for this number of reps? And they were much more accurate with a given load. And it just pretty much scaled with experience. So I think the data, when you look at it holistically, does suggest that training age, especially for compound movements, is probably going to be a moderating factor as far as your ability to gauge proximity to failure. But as is, how many sets you've done and how many reps are in a set. Because as I would describe it, the haze of fatigue, or as PhD candidate Martin Ruffalo, who was a lead author on the failure meta-analysis we talked about last time, would describe discomfort and rating of perceived exertion have a lot of overlap. And we have studies where if you look at session RPE, not like RIR-based RPE, if you do sets of 20 to 30, you're going to have a 10 or 20% higher session RPE. How hard did that whole session feel at the end? Even if it's the same exercises and same number of sets, and therefore, based on what we know on average, a similar, stimulus for muscle growth. So if you decide to use exercises which inherently produce more cardiometabolic fatigue because they are, big compound movements that train the whole body, and you decide to do high reps, and you decide to restrict your rest intervals, you're going to drive up your discomfort a lot. It'll be a hard session. It will require a lot of grit, but you're probably going to be shorter from failure than you think you are. And when you are hitting failure or volitional failure or fatigue, it's going to be for reasons that are not primarily muscular, which will get you in good shape, but will not necessarily change the shape of your muscles as effectively as doing something that is going to be more of a stimulus. So ultimately, I think there is a place for short rest intervals, because the argument against that, say, 1 minute versus 3 minute study that you said was, well, those people who just rested 1 minute, they could then do more volume.
And there are studies that equate that and that show a benefit to that.
And when you equate volume, that benefit of longer rest intervals goes away. But then we think like, okay, but why don't we just train smart in every aspect? Instead of hurting myself with short rest intervals and doing more volume, how about if I know that the more volume I benefit from, because you don't always benefit from more volume, I do more volume and rest longer. And at this point you go, well, I can't have my sessions be too long. And you go, okay, so maybe I need a higher frequency. And then we get back to our previous conversation, or we can start thinking about ways to make training more efficient from a time perspective without hurting rest intervals. And that's where things like antagonist paired sets come in, where you do a chest and a back movement, or a bicep and a tricep movement, or a leg extension and a leg curl. Once again, making sure you're in decent enough shape to kind of do that, because you are still moving the whole time, but at least you're not generating local fatigue and causing issues. Or you could say, you know what, on the exercises where I'm really not at risk of feeling like I ran a 400-meter sprint, how about on calf raises and biceps and triceps? A lot of my single joint work, I can do drop sets. I can do rest pause. I can just rest a minute and not have to worry about it, because you're probably, unless you're in really bad shape, you're probably not going to be generating the type of fatigue that's going to trigger that central fatigue that's going to impede your ability to train those muscle groups. Because the data we have on drop sets, on rest pause sets, on short rest intervals, and we're talking about arm training, it doesn't seem to, there's not a consistently negative benefit or consistently negative effect from restricting rest intervals. So I think you just need to be intelligent with it, and you can have a more efficient training session, but the time and place for that needs to be on exercises where they're not prone to generating a whole lot of fatigue. They're not training a whole bunch of muscle groups at once.
Can I inject real quick?
Absolutely.
Okay, so since we talked about spectrums of rest intervals, can we discuss cluster sets? It's a pretty big thing that a lot of people are deploying and putting into their workout programming. Scott Stevenson talked about muscle rounds, which was his version, Lee Costa's version of muscle rounds, I think was a different name to it. But what does the research show on cluster sets when you're overloading on the progressive end and you're talking like 3, 5, 6 reps, or you're doing something DC based in terms of, effects out there for hypertrophy? Going the other end of the spectrum where you're resting longer and then you're finding this perfect minute. What about the people who just want strength, want that nasty progressive overloads king, which I think is an argument we could all make in different ways. I personally think it's a blend, but what does the research show on cluster sets for the people who are interested in that side of it?
Great question. So I would refer people to a lot of work that's done by the lead author, Jukic. Ivan Jukic, he's doing his PhD out here. It's actually being examined at the moment, so he's soon to be Dr. Jukic.
Sweet.
One thing I will say, there's going to be a disconnect between some of the cluster sets you described and what people use out there versus the kind of research-based, more consensus definition. One isn't right or wrong. We just need to make sure that we understand what we're talking about. So in the research, you can generally classify things as cluster sets or rest redistribution sets. And what that means is that a rest redistribution set is going to last as long as the number of sets that you might do on another exercise. So if let's say I did 3 sets of 5 with 3 minutes rest in between, that might be, 3, 6, maybe 8 minutes in total, counting the time actually training and the rest periods in between. If instead of 3 sets of 5, I did 15 total reps and I did, a double and rest. I actually can't do the math like out loud in my head, but if I had rest intervals between every 2 reps or every rep, so I did 15 total reps, but I just redistributed those 2 blocks of 3 minutes so that between every rep or every couple reps, but the same amount of total time was still 8 minutes, that would be a rest redistribution set. A cluster set is time inefficient. A cluster set is defined by resting potentially longer than that, so that 8-minute process of either doing 3 by 5 or 15 by 1, basically, with little short rests, now becomes 15 by 1 with longer rests if I need it, just basically going back, after a full minute instead of 30 seconds or what have you. So rest redistribution and traditional sets both take 8 minutes. The cluster set might take 16. And the reason why cluster sets are done in that manner is to basically keep fatigue as low as possible. And that's a different use than you'll typically see in physique circles, where you're trying to stay in the right level of fatigue, kind of like a myo rep, where you want to have high activation. So cluster sets and rest redistribution sets are generally used in strength training where the person is trying to mitigate fatigue and use the highest load possible. And the research generally suggests, if we look at some of the meta-analyses on short-term and long-term outcomes, that you can better preserve the acute effects of velocity and power. So basically the velocity per rep, the power produced per rep, which is of course a function of the velocity, force times velocity equals power, is higher because you're preventing fatigue, neuromuscular fatigue, which is you can measure acute neuromuscular fatigue by the decline in velocity loss. Velocity loss is less when you're doing cluster sets or rest redistribution sets. And in a long-term effect, that doesn't seem to impact strength, because slow speed strength or like 1RMs are primarily based upon maximal intent to produce velocity and force. However, it does seem to impact, say, jump height and power performance. So cluster sets and rest redistribution sets might be better for athletes who need to produce higher velocities at lower loads. And as far as hypertrophy or muscular endurance, they're either as good or slightly worse, which makes sense when you think about it. But that's that specific use of it. There is not good data on the type of like myo rep type approaches to staying in the pocket, if you will, of muscle activation. There is some studies on rest pause which suggest they can be as good as traditional training with the limited data we have now, which makes sense. I think exercise selection is important. Some of the data on squatting, for example, doesn't always turn out as favorable as you'd expect. And if you think about it, if you have to do 15 unracks, that's good from like a technical practice perspective as a power lifter, but yeah, hard. Like, so you're trying to manage fatigue, but now you have to unrack a heavy ass squat 15 times instead of 3 times, So yeah.
You said exercise selection is very important. Are you specifically, to go a little lower, meaning exercise selection per person based upon their individual structure? Or are you saying like, here is a golden list of exercises that people need to be like going and digging in the weeds on in the research?
Good point of clarification. So I think exercise selection is very important when you're considering using quote unquote intensity techniques or when you're restricting rest intervals. Mm-hmm. Because if you are choosing exercises which train large groups of muscle mass, you're more likely to induce enough cardiometabolic fatigue that it leads to central fatigue, or at least that's what we think is happening. And you start to impede your ability to recruit higher threshold motor units. So that is more of a generally broad applicable thing to everybody, that, hey, if you're going to do a block of training where you're restricting rest intervals and supersetting stuff, you probably want to be doing more machine-based things and isolation exercises so that the fatigue you're experiencing is local muscular fatigue rather than broader global fatigue from that cardiovascular strain and just the huffing and puffing that you're going to be doing.
Absolutely.
Eric, thank you for that answer, man. That was really in depth, and I wish that was more on social media than I was ranting on the Excellence Cartel with a question I got asked about, like, just some exercise selection. I'm like, banded versus non-banded hack squats. I'm like, it depends. Everything's in context to what you're trying to do at that time, So anyway, thank you for clarifying that. I feel like that was helpful for me as a coach to hear. So hopefully some listeners found that as helpful too.
Absolutely. So in totality, when we look, because you already went into advanced training techniques, so we hit a couple of them, but really when we look at it from like, say, like a broad viewpoint of literature, I think it's safe to say, and Eric, you can correct me if you feel differently or your interpretation of the research is in a different viewpoint, but really when it comes down to it, many of the advanced training techniques, whether it's drop sets or it's cluster sets or rest redistribution sets, when it comes to the area of hypertrophy, the goal being a hypertrophy, they're either equivalent to or a little bit less, beneficial than straight sets in and of themselves, except I think the only caveat, and you actually somewhat hit on this, but is the antagonist paired sets, because we do see some of like the chest and back supersets. There's a study I always remember by Paz et al. That they actually saw better volume load being in the group that utilized I believe it was a bench and row combination than when they did them individually. So, there is an ability to get a better benefit, even though it's more time efficient, but especially when we utilize antagonist muscle groups.
Yeah, and this is an interesting finding that's been replicated in a couple groups. I think there's also one by Maya on leg extension, leg curl,
You're
that with
exactly right.
the 1 minute rest period, they actually perform better than the other groups, even the ones not doing antagonist paired sets. So we've observed this effect of being able to actually do more total work, which either means they're maintained a higher load or they got more reps. If you look at the study designs, um, in groups doing antagonist paired sets, which, to clarify, antagonist paired set, what the hell does that mean? It just means that it is the antagonist muscle group. So, if you're doing elbow flexion, bicep curl, we're talking elbow extension, your tricep. If you're doing leg extension, it's leg curl, bench press, row, that type of deal. Overhead press, pull down. You can think of basically two opposite. It's when the eccentric of one is the concentric of the other. That's a simple way of thinking of it. And multiple times now that has been shown. All the data that I'm aware of on it either shows an equivalent or actually slightly better effect for the group doing antagonist paired sets. So it might be that reduces the inhibition that might come from the antagonist muscle group as it's resting. It might be better
It's
because
a priming effect.
Yeah, it's basically a little priming effect. It could be more efficient resting. So when you think about it, the muscles of your chest are moving while you're doing a row, but they're not actively contracting, and that could maybe help with local edema and blood flow. I'm totally speculating. It's not clear as to why. It could be something physiological. It could be something more neural or something in between. But ultimately, it suggests that, hey, if during the rest period you'd normally have on, say, a row, you're actually pressing, but you have the same amount of total rest period, or even shorter, you can perform just as well, if not slightly better. And what this might look like, for example, instead of doing 3 sets of bench with a 2-minute rest interval, and then 3 sets of let's say seal row with a 2-minute rest interval, you do bench, rest a minute, seal row, rest a minute, or you could even shorten that a little bit so that your total rest time is maybe 25% less. You just basically, and this is kind of a general guidance, anytime you're doing compound movements or anything that you think can make you physically tired, you rest as long as you feel you need to get back up to to be able to perform. Sometimes you can look at heart rate if you're wearing something until it comes back down to what it was before you started your next set. But yeah, basically when I do antagonist paired sets on, say, bench and seal row, I just rest until I feel I'm ready to do the next one. And I end up getting like a 10 or 20% time improvement than if I did bench, 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 row, row, row. And I think you can do that even a little more aggressively on isolation movements. Like your leg extension, leg curl is a tough one because the burn can be pretty bad. And you can just kind of, they're big muscles, your quad and your hamstring. But I find like bicep curl, tricep push down is not a problem at all.
Absolutely. No, that the Maya study is really interesting because their findings are a little counterintuitive. I always remember this study because it was actually only the leg curl to leg extension condition that saw a benefit. But when they reversed that for some reason, did leg extension to leg curl, they didn't see the same outcomes in terms of benefits for total volume load. So, it's obviously movement specific, but in generalities, like when we look at the advanced training techniques, many are going to be as good or a little bit less. But when it comes to that one modality, antagonist paired sets, that's one that I use most frequently with my own athletes and with myself, because there are benefits, especially not only, it's not going to take away from the productivity of each set that you do, but it's also going to add to the ability to be more time efficient and be able to get in and out of the gym in a more time effective manner.
Absolutely. I've done work on in mass, like I did a video on just how to be more time efficient and essentially setting up your compounds to do antagonist paired sets and then doing drop sets and rest pause on your isolation movements. And then occasionally you can do things like working an isolation movement that's just not really impacted by a compound. So it's not an antagonist paired set, but like between sets of deadlifts, you do some calf raises. It probably won't have any impact on performance of either one, but will be a little more time efficient. And those are great. And you'd be surprised. You can take a workout that would have been 90 minutes and get it down to 50 minutes.
No, it honestly is surprising. A lot of people will tell me, like, when I have certain clients come to me and they're used to being in the gym, say 90 minutes or 2 hours, but now they've had a child or they've gotten relocated in terms of their profession, or they're taking on more job responsibilities or personal responsibilities. Like, listen, you don't have to be in the gym for 2 hours a day. Maybe you were competitive bodybuilding, that's what you thought you had to do, but there's many roads that lead to Rome, and we could find training programming principles, and we can modify and manipulate them to best suit your goal, but also the constraints of your lifestyle and your schedule.
Well said. Totally agree.
All right. So the last hypertrophy topic that I wanted to get into, and this is something that it has been of deep interest to me. And I find, honestly, I think this is probably what I find to be like the most interesting findings that have been consistently coming out in the literature in the last couple of years, are the benefits of stretch mediated hypertrophy. So, Eric, when it comes down to hypertrophy outcomes, how do hypertrophy outcomes essentially differ between training at lengthened and shortened positions? And if so, if some muscles seem to respond better to being trained through the lengthened range or not? And I'm sure you can extrapolate or expand on the research that we've seen on that.
Yeah, and the question is that stretch mediated hypertrophy? Is that something different? So yeah, there have been there's kind of a research arc here where I can't remember the meta-analysis, and this one I promise I won't look up. I'm going to hold back on the OCD-ness, but I think Schoenfeld might have been involved, where overall they found there seemed to be a slight benefit of training at full ranges of motion versus partial. And then there was a letter to the editor related to that saying, hey, there are some studies where that's not the case. And specifically, when those shorter ranges of motion include the lengthened position of the muscle group, they seem to be equivalent, or actually sometimes better. I think there's a study by Pedrosa where they observed that in leg extensions, where the group training in the bottom portion of the leg extension, kind of like just doing the bottom third, actually grew more than the group that was doing the full range of motion. So this has been shown multiple times where similar range of motion, say a group doing the top half of a curl and the group doing the bottom half of a curl, get different results, and the group doing the bottom half of the curl, where they're training the lengthened position, gets superior hypertrophy. And indeed, there is enough research now, and there was a meta-analysis that Milo Wolf, who's doing his PhD out at Solent, led, where when you specifically look at lengthened partials, they seem to have a distinct advantage. The jury is yet out over whether they have an advantage over training the full range of motion, which makes sense considering the full range of motion includes that lengthened position. But there's more data now suggesting that being able to produce a higher level of tension in the lengthened position is kind of one of the key, I wouldn't say mechanistic aspects because we don't actually know the mechanism, but the applied aspect of what's doing the magic, right? Absolutely. So, there's data on, squats seeming to hypertrophy the vasti a little better than leg extensions. And when you think about it, if you're doing a deep squat, you're actually getting more range about the knee. So in that deep position, there is a greater stretch on the quadriceps. So you're actually seeing some greater hypertrophy, probably mediated by that. We've seen this in the hamstrings, same range of motion, right? But changing the amount of stretch. There's a study, I'm forgetting the lead author. This one I might have to look up because it's going to bother me.
This is Mayo et al.
Mayo, thank you. Because I was thinking Maya, and I was like, no, Maya's the one.
They've got two studies, the tricep and the hamstrings.
Mayo has, one showing both the triceps and the hamstrings, where same range of motion, but simply altering the joint position so that it's in a more stretched position. So having an overhead tricep extension where the long head is stretched, or doing a seated leg curl. So you're kind of in like a sit and reach position to where the hamstring is more stretched. And the muscles that are more stretched end up growing more. So a cool thing about the Mayo study, they compared seated to lying hamstring curls. Not only did the hamstrings grow more in the seated position where they're stretched, but the sartorius grew more in the lying hamstring position. And if you look at the attachment side of the sartorius on the front of the hip, and it is a weak knee flexor, it actually is more stretched when you're standing straight rather than bending the hip. And so this pattern was very clear. Sartorius grew a little more in the lying leg curl. Hamstring group grew more when you're in the seated leg curl, and same range of motion, right, about the knee. So there does seem to be something of, I guess it would be passive tension is included in the stimulative process of inducing hypertrophy, in addition to the active tension actually produced by contracting or going through the eccentric action. So it's something we're still uncovering. And I would say that stretch-mediated hypertrophy is something that might be separate. And there is research that I've been really digging into, primarily done by a group in Germany, led by who I think is a PhD student, probably near completing based upon how much research he's published, Warneke and colleagues. So if you, it hasn't come out yet, Brandon, but you're going to really love my video for MASS coming out on the 1st, because it's all about like the 7 studies that Warneke has done in the last year.
I actually, if you don't mind, after we go through stretch, like this concept of stretch mediated hypertrophy, a couple of the studies within this, I definitely want to go a little bit more into the leg extension study by Pedrosa, because I think that was like the first one that opened all of our eyes to like, you know, we used to look at, you know, full range of motion versus shortened range of motion. And we would look at the fact that in most studies, we saw better outcomes from utilizing a full range of motion as compared to a partial range. But that first study with Pedrosa with the leg extension, what I want to allude to within that study was they had 3 conditions. They had a partial range in the top position. So essentially the overload or the peak contraction was in the shortened position. They had a full range. So think about the full extent of the leg extension. You're going full range. But then you would think that that would be the greatest hypertrophy outcomes, because that's going through the fullest range. However, they also had a partial condition that was only in the bottom position. So when they reached their point of peak tension, they were still in a more lengthened position. Also, the other confounding factor of this is that they utilize a higher load in that condition with the partial range in the bottom position than they did in the full range condition, and they saw greater hypertrophy outcomes from the partial range in the stretch position. So now it's not just full range of motion. Maybe it's that full range of motion includes the lengthened position. And that's why we're seeing greater outcomes than in the partial range condition. And specifically, it's not just about you can get an equivalent outcomes from either partial range, because we see in like bicep studies by Sato, it's a lengthened range, which, you know, putting in the lengthened position, that stretch position, that is getting greater hypertrophy outcomes than when we utilize a partial range in that fully contracted position. And so what I did want to, if you wouldn't mind, giving us a little recap on your calf experiment study, because that comes from the Warneke design.
Absolutely, it does. And yeah, I think a good way to characterize that fact that in Pedrosa, if you look at the supplementary material, they used higher loads in the lengthened partial group. They were able to use higher loads.
Absolutely.
Which I think is important. Because when you have an exercise where the biomechanics are such that the limiting portion of the lift is a shortened position, that means you're going to be limited by the load in the real world of the position that's shortened, which means it's going to reduce the tension when you're in a lengthened position. But if now all of a sudden you're modifying the exercise so that you're only doing the lengthened position, and it just so happens that biomechanically you can use a higher load in that position, you're enhancing the tension in that lengthened position, which is where the conclusion comes from, that it's not just being in that lengthened position, it's also being able to produce some high tension there. So I think that's a really great point, Brandon. So yeah, the stretch-mediated hypertrophy is something, at least from an applied perspective, different. That's actually stretching, passive stretching. And this is where it gets cool, because now we're not contracting. We're not exercising in a traditional sense of resistance training. We are literally just holding a stretch. And the study that kind of caught everyone by surprise, I guess you could say, that kind of squared the circle on the animal research and coming into the human research, is these long duration static stretching. And what was done by Warneke and colleagues, and what I have actually just finished replicating in a within subject single study myself design, and we're actually doing our last measurement in 2 days, is a mechanism by holding a stretch of the calf. So it's basically a boot that forces you into dorsiflexion, and you can tighten it over time as you gain more range. And what Warneke and colleagues did last year was they had a couple of groups, one group doing nothing, the control group, and another group. And these, by the way, these are recreationally active individuals. So a mix of athletes and some people who are resistance trained. So probably relatively low calf training experience, if you will, but not untrained, which is important. They had that group stretch one calf an hour per day in the boot, and the other group and the other leg not doing it at all. And there was a 15% increase in muscle thickness as measured by ultrasound at the end of 6 weeks, which is comparable, if not greater, than what you see in terms of muscle thickness changes from resistance training. And this is not the only study that Warneke and colleagues has done. There's actually recently, just a couple of weeks ago, I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, there was a sex differences study where they used the same exact design, published in Frontiers in Physiology that Warnke did, and they actually compared sex differences. And they looked at not only at improvements in isometric calf strength and range of motion using the knee to wall test, as well as just what position could they get the boot to, but also medial and lateral gastroc muscle thickness. And they found that the men grew significantly more looking at one head of the gastroc and gained more strength. We're talking 2 to 3-fold more as far as the actual increase in thickness. So this seems to actually have a sex difference. Is it a sex difference, or is it just a range of motion or flexibility difference? I'm not sure if it's a sex difference per se. It could just be that if we had done a study on all women and you used, let's say, non-parametric statistics, rank ordered them in terms of baseline flexibility, that we would have seen greater growth in the less flexible individuals. Because the idea here is, and they speculated in the paper, that, hey, the fact that there are sex differences in stretching might indicate that something unique is going on here. Because
it's more of a novel stimulus to the men, essentially.
Maybe, so there's an interesting thing here. So the big question we all need to ask ourselves is, okay, we've got these studies that have been done on long duration stretching in humans now that are showing similar data to the data in animals. But is this complementary, or is it redundant to resistance training? Because there was a meta-analysis done showing that on average, you put people through resistance training with the full range of motion, it is a stretching stimulus. It does increase range of motion. And if you think about it, you're going through a loaded stretch. If you sit down at the bottom of a squat, that's a stretch on all those muscles that are now lengthened under load. That's true of every exercise you can do. If you're using a full range of motion, if you're using the extent of your current joint range and loading it, you're going to improve your actual joint range of motion in most cases. So is that enough? And is to get the same effect? We don't know. I would say there is enough data and hints at what's going on here to be hopeful, because we know that the relative increase in muscle size that men and women experience from resistance training, we can go all the way back to Hubble 2005, it's the same from a percentage perspective. So the fact that there are sex differences here could mean that these are to some degree a unique stimulus in terms of training. Because if stretching was doing the same thing, completely overlapping with resistance training, there wouldn't be sex differences. So that's interesting. Also, Warnke did a meta-analysis looking at all the animal studies, and where there's crazy hypertrophy. We're talking like effect sizes that are 10 times large.
The most amount of hypertrophy you've ever seen, like the quail studies from Jose Antonio.
Exactly. So, waiting limbs for days at a time. So, it's not an hour a day, it's weeks. And one of the things, they cited another study by McDougall and colleagues just in the discussion, and they said that the hyperplasia, so that's the addition of new muscle fibers, which is a controversial topic in humans, but has been observed in animals. If you looked at this meta-analysis, they found, again, that 10 times a large effect, not only in hypertrophy, but also in the number of fibers, hyperplasia. You may just simply not be able to get that effect from traditional resistance training. So interesting. So if you're holding a long duration static stretch, and for context, not just duration, but also the intensity matters, Warnke had people getting into an initial stretch discomfort. If 10 is the maximum discomfort you can handle, they had to get to an 8. So not fun. And I can personally attest.
As in all things, like in training, that's why when we look at stretching, there aren't, additive effects to just a stretch, doing a minute, wall stretch or something of that sort. But also it's usually comfortable. You're trying to ease, maybe some discomfort or soreness you have. But in all aspects of life, to force an adaptation, there needs to be some discomfort there to initiate growth. So I would assume, I'm going to be honest with you, Eric, I had plantar fasciitis years ago. So I'm very familiar with the device. And I wanted to get your, your interpretation or even just your experience with it, because I bought another pair. And if this stuff works, man, I'm strapping myself up while I'm doing podcasts, just like you.
Beautiful. Yeah. So exactly. So Warnke has actually done a lot of work. People are really aware of that one study that showed the 15%, but they did foundational work first. They did work where they compared 5 sets of 12 to failure on calf raises versus an hour-long stretch, and looked at the decrement or the increase in range of motion afterwards, as well as the force deficit. So immediately, we know this from prior research. If you stretch right now and train, you're not going to be as strong. The decrement in force was almost identical between those two. So they induced similar force deficit, and the range of motion was not significantly different between groups, but it was slightly greater from a percentage perspective from stretching, which makes sense. So that's kind of evidence suggesting, hey, at least acutely, stretching and resistance training have similar effects on the muscle tendon unit. So that's kind of like, that's me saying, hey, these could be similar effects, but that's not looking at muscle physiology or morphology. The sex differences study, that gives a hint maybe something different is going on. The meta-analysis, where we look at the fact that hyperplasia is occurring to a greater degree than is normally observed in training studies on animals, maybe something else is going on. And now to speak to my experience, the third little piece of information, and the Warnke mentioned this, so it made me feel like I'm not alone, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, is that in one of their studies, using this 1 hour long calf stretch device at an 8 out of 10 discomfort initially, most participants experienced tingling and numbness within 10 to 15 minutes. And I 100% experienced that. When it actually goes to the point where first it's really painful because you're at 8 out of 10. Then your ankle starts to adapt and it goes down to maybe a 6 out of 10. But that's fine because that means you've actually produced enough stretch to get an acute change. And then the tingling comes in, so it gets a little better. And then like pins and needles sucks after a while. Like it starts to just hurt and be painful and uncomfortable. And then you've got another half an hour. So, so I found it extremely uncomfortable, painful, not fun. And seeing that was actually the case in others. And Warnke specifically said, this may be producing a hypoxic environment because when you stretch a muscle a whole lot, you're actually compressing the vasculature to the point where oxygen delivery is poor. So some of those pins and needles could be related to the fact that, you're in hip flexion and you're, compressing a nerve, but probably a good chunk of it is more related to creating a hypoxic environment. So that also says something like, hey, even when you do BFR, that the 40 rep primer set that lasts, maybe a minute. But if you're holding that for an hour, that's a hypoxic environment under a high degree of passive tension for a long period of time. So there's something different might be going on here. We need more data to tease that out. But so my experience, what I've done for the last, it'll come up on 13 weeks and 2 days. What I did, it's actually in total, it's a 17-week study. So just myself. For the first 4 weeks, I was just doing my current calf volume of 20 sets per week. And that was an increase, but I've been doing it for a while and just measuring once a week my muscle thickness. And then at the end of it, my circumference of my calf, just to get an idea of what's my normal variation. So that includes measurement error, biological variation, and potentially any increase I'm getting from my normal training. So that's kind of our metrics. So now we have what we call a minimum clinical difference of whether or not I'm actually seeing an increase. We're using that 4 weeks. Then for the next 12 weeks, I wore the boot, both legs, because I'm not trying to get one calf bigger than the other.
Did you do them at the same time?
No, my dumbass, 6 weeks in, I was like, I should really get another one. And then I just didn't. And then every week I was like, I'm almost done. I only got
so I already bought 2, but I wanted to know if you did both at the same time. Because when I used it years ago when I actually had I used it just for the fact that I had plantar fasciitis. I had to wear both at the same time. And they were extremely uncomfortable. So I can relate to you how you're feeling. But I was wondering, because yes, in the Warnke study, they only utilized one. So I wasn't sure if you were doing the same thing or if you were doing 1 hour and 1 hour, but I can only imagine, because I know you did this while you were on podcasts. Like I wasn't really able to do much during the time that I had that boot on. So I can only imagine. I commend you.
Podcasts, writing, and then Netflix and chill time with my wife, and playing Street Fighter 2 on my stick at home. So that's basically how I got through it. But extremely uncomfortable. Typically, I felt like, man, I can't keep doing this. Typically around 20 to 30 minutes in, and then you just don't stop. So it did get better over time. I found in the last 4 weeks, I felt like I was adapting to it, and the boot I had, like if you look at the Warnke studies, they had like proper funding and like they created a custom unit. I bought the thing that looked the most like it on Amazon, made in China, for $25. And it works, don't get me wrong, but it's Velcro, right? So the 2 Velcro straps on either side I did. So initially it was fine because I didn't have that much dorsiflexion range. One thing I can tell you, I haven't analyzed the ultrasound yet, but in the knee to wall test, I've gained like 3.5 centimeters on my range. So, and I gained, I don't know what the exact amount was, but the amount of Velcro overlap was totally fine to start. And I got eventually to the point where the Velcro was past the overlap point. It's like up just on the plastic. So there was nothing for me to latch it on. So I had to go buy these two backpack like carabiners to basically just have it go through a little more distance so that there'd be more space to overlap. Well, eventually, even with the carabiners, it got to the point where there was no Velcro overlap. So what I had to start doing was I would get it in position and I'd push like 6 tacks through it,
Wow.
which I have lying all over the house, which is dangerous because they'd pop off sometimes. I'm like, oh shit, and I grab it and I put the tack back through. So I had like 6 tacks going through these same side of the Velcro because it completely overlapped as I pulled itself through. Because I pulled myself into such substantial dorsiflexion. That'll be an interesting methods section to write, talking about tacks.
That's clear indication of progressive overload, right?
Exactly. So because each time I'm doing the same thing, I'm getting into an 8 out of 10 discomfort, and then I have to hang out there for an hour and just sitting, and then having my leg out in front of me. So it's in a 45-degree or 90-degree angle from my body, position of hip flexion with a straight knee. So that did that for 12 weeks. And now what we're doing is I've gone into a deload week. I'm going from 20 sets of calves to 12 sets of calves, still using my full range of motion. So that's one interesting thing, is that my range of motion on exercises, anytime there's dorsiflexion involved, has increased. Getting to depth on squats, leg press is easier. Calf raises, like my leg press that I have at home that I do calf raises on, my heel actually touches like a part of the apparatus where the thing is, where it didn't previously, which is kind of crazy. So I'm using that full range of motion in my training. So the question now is, okay, we have the 4-week baseline. We have the start of the 12 weeks. We have the 6-week mid test. That's the benefit of a case study. You can take a lot of measurements. We have the end of the 12 weeks. And now we're going to have 1 week where I'm not stretching to see if I can maintain it with just 12 sets of full range of motion calf training. And I think the interesting thing will be, okay, if I can't maintain it, that might indicate that these are 2 different stimuli, but if simply accessing that new range and then training through it with resistance training is sufficient to maintain it, that means you don't have to live in a, calf brace for the rest of your life to maintain these gains. So, yeah.
Very interesting. I love the personal case studies. Like I know Dr. Scott has done some of these. Chris Barakat has done some of these. I always find it extremely interesting. We're really bridging the gap between what we see in research and then applying it to ourselves and going through them. And we're not going to cover it today because we have taken way too much of your time. But there is another study that you did that was by authors that do a bunch of case studies that has great findings. But Eric, I find that to be extremely fascinating. And I really appreciate you not only sharing, what we've seen in the research, but also in your own personal practice.
It's a pleasure and a privilege, and I would encourage everyone. I'm not sure when this episode is out, but Friday. By the 1st of February, perfect. It'll already be out. And if you are not a mass subscriber, I do know it does cost money. So it's not easy to just go and quick and sign up if you don't have the funds. But I will just say, if you want to see a 45-minute video of me going through all the research that Warnke has done to get a better idea of stretch-mediated hypertrophy, that's in the upcoming episode. So, or issue, I should say.
Awesome. Jeff, tie us up, my man.
Dude, well, thanks for joining us, man. I always like it when you answer my questions, because I always ask those weird ones. So I really appreciate that. But I really have to have I'm going to put together a podcast episode for Brandon to bring you on. It maybe we could get Alberto to join on.
Yes, absolutely.
Pick about just talking about the Dorian Yates versus the Arnolds versus this versus that, the backload, but do 2 max sets, then back off, and all these different things you see. So I think that'd be a cool conversation. But thank you again, Ed, for taking the time to join us today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on, man.
Where can everybody find you guys? I recommend his book. I actually pimped it out at the PEC event. People asking me about where to learn more about women's hormones. And, he was with, why is that name escaping me?
Lyle McDonald.
When they wrote the women's book, volume 1, which is a resource I have actually up on my bookcase. But where can everybody buy all your books and just bathe in your glory?
I only had a very small part, and only at the first few editions before Lyle had a falling out with me and decided that he was going to remove that section from his books. So if you want
to follow up on that, we did cover. I had some people ask me within the audience Q&A what books I did recommend. I had to shout out Alan Aragon sitting in the audience, Dr. Scott, but also the Muscle and Strength Pyramids. by yours truly. So you were in attendance. Your main book was given some highlight, because it is a really great contribution to this industry. So regardless if they get Lyle's or not, it's still get Dr. Eric's book.
It's still a good book. Don't get me wrong. I think what I will say though is that anyone who does get the women's book, I would just temper the enthusiasm for some of the phase-based training stuff as more and more data has come out.
We just covered that on our podcast last week, my man.
Listen to the podcast last week and then take everything with a grain of salt. But there's really good information just on female physiology, period there. Muscleandstrengthpyramids.com if you're interested in getting my books, which we're working on the 3rd edition now. 3dmusclejourney.com is the one-stop shop for links to all the stuff I do, and then Iron Culture. And if you want to see where I am on other podcasts like this lovely podcast, follow me at Helms3DMJ on Instagram, and I will be sharing those whenever I appear.
Sweet. Awesome. Well, thanks, Chance. I hope you have yourself a badass day and kick ass.
Later.
See ya.
Peace.